Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Chapter 18 on the respiratory system. So in class we will be learning about Emily's case and about asthma. And a little introduction. This is oxygen and it's going to guide you through the respiratory system and you can call it O2. We're going to start out with the phases of respiration. First phase is pulmonary ventilation, which is air moves in and out of the lungs. And this is the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the alveoli, which are the air sacs in your lungs. The second phase of respiration is the external gas exchange. And this is gas exchange that occurs in the lungs between the blood and the air in the alveoli. And the oxygen, or O2, as you will see in this slideshow, in the air diffuses into the blood, and carbon dioxide, or CO2, in the blood diffuses into the air. Another phase of respiration is the gas transport in the blood. And this is something you'll be familiar with from the cardiovascular system, where the blood transports oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and CO2, or carbon dioxide, from the tissues to the lungs. And the fourth phase of respiration is the external gas exchange. The internal gas exchange. And this is the gas exchange between the capillaries and the tissue cells, and where oxygen in the blood diffuses into the tissues, and CO2 in the tissues diffuses into the blood. Next up, we're going to look at the organs or the structures of the respiratory system. And as you'll see, we're going to look at the nose and nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and the alveoli. So let's start where oxygen enters the body, the nose, nasal cavities, and paranasal sinuses. So as I said, air enters the body through the nostrils and then travels to the nasal cavity, which is found between the roof of the mouth and the cranium. And nasal cavity, and indeed everything in this area, is covered in mucous membranes. Here, air is warmed and moistened, and also it helps filter out dust and pathogens. And there are also surrounding paranasal sinuses. These are found in all of the bones of the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, and the maxillary bones. All of these will open into the nasal cavity, so they are kind of a continuation of that. They're also important for other reasons. They're a resonating chamber for speech, and you will know what your voice would kind of sound like if you have ever been really stuffed up. Question for you is, what is sinusitis? Using your medical terminology. So let's take a look at this. So air and oxygen in there enters the nostrils, into the nose, into the nasal cavity, and then in the bone itself you have sinuses. Frontal sinus in the frontal bone, the sphenoid sinus in the sphenoid bone, ethmoid sinuses within the ethmoid bone, and then maxillary sinuses within the maxillary bone, which is right here and here. So after oxygen and air goes through the nasal cavity, it will travel to the pharynx, which is common between the respiratory system and the digestive system, commonly known as your throat. So that is a muscular organ, and it carries food and liquids down into the esophagus for the digestive system, and then it carries air into the trachea in the respiratory system. And it has a couple of parts. The nasopharynx is the upper portion of the pharynx, and it's behind or posterior to the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is the middle portion, and that is behind or posterior to the mouth, and that's the part that houses the tonsils and the uvula. And the laryngopharynx opens to the larynx and to the esophagus. So let's take a look at these. So as we know, the air entered through the nostrils, into the nasal cavity, and then into the pharynx, which here is the nasopharynx, and then the oropharynx, and you can see the uvula, and then your tonsils here, and then down into the laryngopharynx, and then it will either go, food and liquids will go into the esophagus, and then we're going to look a little more carefully at the larynx. This epiglottis would tip down so that the food didn't go into the trachea, it would just go through the esophagus. But otherwise it's open and air goes into the larynx and then down into the trachea. So after the pharynx, the air will go into the larynx, which is found inferiorly of the pharynx and also of the hyoid bone, and is superior of the trachea. There's a nice picture of that on page 404, and I would recommend looking at that. The larynx is made out of cartilage, and when you are swallowing, the larynx moves up and forward, and the epiglottis that we looked at just on the previous slide tilts down, and it covers the larynx so food doesn't go into the trachea. Because when you're swallowing food, liquids, or saliva, and you want that to go into the esophagus. So the larynx is closed during swallowing, but is open while you are breathing the rest of the time. And the larynx contains folds of mucous membrane, and these are known as your vocal cords, and these are what produce speech. The vibrations are what produce your words and sound. So let's take a look at the larynx. As we know, the pharynx would be connecting it here, and then it is connected to the hyoid bone, and it is made out of cartilage. And looking here, the laryngeal prominence is known as your Adam's apple, and you could all find that on yourself. And then over on the sagittal section, the side view, we see there's this epiglottis, and when you are swallowing, the whole larynx will move up and the epiglottis will come down and close off your larynx and therefore your trachea, so food and water goes down the esophagus, not here. And then we're going to talk next about the trachea, and that is where oxygen goes after the larynx. So looking at the trachea, this is a tube connecting the larynx and the bronchi, and it is made of C-shaped hyaline cartilage rings and of connective tissue. So it's different than the esophagus, which was a muscular tube, because the trachea we want to keep open all the time so the oxygen and air can go down into our lungs. And that's what those C-shaped hyaline cartilage rings do, is they keep it open. It's also lined with cilia and mucous membranes, which move trapped particles up to the pharynx so they can be cleared out of your throat and never make it to your lungs. And they're actually beating 20 times per minute, so quite a bit. Let's take a look at this. As you can see from this picture, here's the hyoid bone and the larynx, and then this is your trachea, which is going to connect to your bronchi, which is where they split into right and left bronchi. So looking at a cross-section of the trachea, we can see here is one of those C-shaped cartilage rings, and then your open trachea. This is where your air goes through. Then you can see the esophagus is a muscular tube that's mostly closed right now. And you can also see this artery, a large artery, the carotid artery. So after air makes it through the trachea, it's going to go into the bronchi, and your trachea branches into two bronchi, and the bronchi also have cartilage to keep them open. And then your bronchi will branch more, and they're called bronchioles, which will branch smaller and smaller. And as I mentioned, the bronchi have cartilage to keep them open, whereas the bronchioles are made of smooth muscle. And the question is, what would be controlling the smooth muscle in your bronchioles? Let's take a look at this picture here. So we have the trachea right here. There it is. And that's going to branch into the bronchi, which then branch even further. And then we have our bronchioles, and we're going to look at the terminal bronchioles are going to end in our air sacs called alveoli. So our oxygen and air has now made it to the lungs, and this is the organ where the gas exchange occurs. So the diaphragm separates the lungs from the abdominal cavity. And each lung is surrounded by pleura, which is a double membrane sac which is connected to the chest wall and allows the lungs to expand and contract. So if you think about having two plates of glass and there's liquid in between them, it would be pretty easy to move those two plates up and down from each other, but there'd actually be a lot of resistance to pull those two plates of glass apart. And that's really how your lungs work. They're connected to your chest wall, but they can easily go move within the chest wall, which is good because you wouldn't want to snag your lung and puncture it. So the smallest bronchioles are terminal bronchioles, which end at clusters of air sacs called alveoli. And alveoli are where the magic happens when it comes to the respiratory system. These are specialized structure for gas exchange. So if we want gas exchange, we're going to want diffusion to happen. And what do we need for diffusion? Well, thin walls are a really good start. The wall of each alveolus, which is singular, alveoli plural, is made of a single layer of cells, 1 micrometer across, and this allows the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The alveoli are also surrounded by pulmonary capillaries, which are going to be picking up the oxygen and dumping off the CO2. They also have a very large surface area, and we know that that is important for diffusion, for being able to diffuse more gas. So fun fact, you have about 300 million alveoli in your lungs, and if you could measure the surface area of all of that and lay it out, it would have the surface area of about 60 square meters, which is the same area as our classroom floor. So you have a lot of surface area for breathing. Also, the surface of the alveoli are covered with a lipid called a surfactant. And fun part of that is the surfactant reduces the surface tension, which allows the alveoli to expand easily so that you can get more oxygen in and out of your lungs. So let's take a little moment to look at this picture. So we have our bronchioles, and our terminal bronchioles are ending in these air sacs or alveoli. And as you can see, there's quite a few of them, so a lot of surface area, and then they're covered in these capillaries to help in the diffusion. So thin walls and really close to capillaries. And also, here's another picture of your lungs with all the alveoli, and it is a cross section. You can see all the air sacs, and then this would be a picture of lungs, and all these white spots are where there is gas. Well, in this video, we made it all the way through the structures of the respiratory system, from the atmosphere to the nose, all the way to the lungs and the alveoli. In our next video, we're going to talk about the process of respiration. See you then.